The Civil War Battle of Shiloh took place April 6th and 7th, 1862, in Hardin County, Tennessee, and resulted in a Union victory over Confederate forces. Nearly 110,000 troops took part in the fighting, which produced almost 24,000 casualties, making it the bloodiest battle to that point in U.S. history. American History TV visited Shiloh National Military Park, where Stacy Allen, the park's chief ranger, gave us a tour of the battlefield. In this portion, he talked about the fighting in a sector of the battlefield known as the Hornets Nest.
We've moved to the center of the Union line astride the Eastern Corinth Road into a position that's iconic with Shiloh, known forever after the battle as the Hornets Nest. They mark the center of the brigades participating in the assaults where the Confederates are attempting to attack the Federals here, and they're doing so in piecemeal fashion, primarily lone brigades making these assaults in succession in some instances over the course of the midday and through the afternoon. They were dead center, pretty much dead center on the battlefield. And the Confederates attack through what they describe as a dense underbrush, a heavy thicketed zone. They called it an impenetrable thicket of young growth, which is different from the normal vegetation on the battlefield, which was old growth forest. The Confederates are attacking through this thicket. People say, well, why are they attacking through the thicket? Because it provided cover. It provided some semblance of protection as they tried to maneuver and get into a position to confront the Federals holding the line here. Besides that, if they moved any further to the north, they'd pass through a wide open field, which would bring their line under enfiladed fire from Federals. And to the south, there's another open field. And the thicket provided cover. It provided some semblance of protection. It is also apparent that these Confederate troops in the thicket rarely ever saw their opponent. The thicket was that dense. They saw the flashes of the muzzle from both the musketry and the artillery. They saw the smoke, but they rarely saw physical form of an enemy force. So we just passed up the Eastern Corinth Road from Confederate markers, which note the farthest advance of the organizations attacking the Hornets Nest, to the Union front that ran parallel to an old wagon cut. What's amazing is nobody in either army really mentions the existence of this road on April 6, 1862. There's not a letter or a battle report or a diary entry that selects on the fact that there's an old wagon cut here. There's 6,200 Federal troops positioned on this wagon cut, and not one of them in April 1862 mentions its existence. Now we know it exists, but they don't select upon it, and that's important because this wagon cut later on becomes an iconic sunken road, and it was nowhere near being sunken. A couple of wagon ruts, 6 to 8 inches deep, maybe a foot deep here as it crossed the top of the ridge. And that's about it in 1862. We know that's about it because in the initial descriptions of it, when they begin to reflect on the fact that, hey, yeah, there was a road there, that's the initial descriptions. And then somebody applied the term partially sunken, and the word stuck. And from that point on, it's known as the sunken road. I refer to it as just a wagon trace. And one of these days, maybe the term sunken will be dropped from the usage, but it's there. It's a post-battle term, and it's stayed and been applied to the road. What it does do, though, is to delineate the Federal position, a position the Federals will hold from the earliest troops arriving here will be under Will Wallace's command. They'll occupy at about 9 o'clock. They'll be joined by Prentice's remnants, which these markers here to our south note. and Prentiss goes into position about 10. Now Prentiss retreats through Wallace and through Hurlbut. He will reorganize his command in the rear of these two divisions. Of his 5,400 men he began the battle with, he gets anywhere from 500 to 600 of his men rallied. He'll be joined by the 23rd Missouri, 575 souls. So Prentiss will come forward with about 1,200 men. And he'll take a position here in the center of the Union position. Wallace's troops on the north, to the right of Prentiss, and Hurlbut's troops to the south. And there's 6,200 men on line, and there's enough troops in reserve to constitute about 3,000 more. So there's a large number of troops on this sector. We know that 2/3 of the Confederate Army at 11 o'clock to noon are engaged against the Union right flank there at Water Oaks Pond and the crossroads. And so you start just factoring out who's not present in that fight. And we know that throughout the course of the late morning and on into the early afternoon, Johnston's getting about a third of his command engaged over at Sarah Bell Farm, the River Road, and the Peach Orchard sector. And you start saying, well, then, you know, that's almost the entire Confederate Army. What does that leave here in the center? That leaves piecemeal brigades in the center. And that's the story at the Nest, is that the Confederates attacked this position, held in force by the Federals, with a repetitive series of assaults by individual lone brigades for the most part. And those brigades are heavily outnumbered. I mean, the largest attack the Confederates throw against this position is no more than about 3,500 souls. So they're outnumbered 2 to 1. And the average attack the Confederates would throw against this position is around 2,000 personnel. So at any point in time, they're clearly outnumbered by their Federal opponent, and then they have to negotiate the thicket and then try to attempt to storm and breast the Federal fire. And the Federal fire coming off this position must have been horrendous, because Confederates afterwards would style that fire and the sound of the whizzing Minnie balls cutting through the forest as the sound of angry hornets. And thus the position forever after will be labeled the Hornets Nest. So the Federals seem to be holding their own quite well here at the Hornets Nest. So what dooms this position? Well, the demise of the Hornets Nest will be what is happening on the extreme right flank and left flank of the Union Army. We know the right flank has been engaged with the greater propulsion of the Confederate force. That right flank, having been driven back to Jones Field before noon, counterattacks. Amazingly, it counterattacks at noon, driving back almost 2/3 of a mile and engaging those Confederate forces again in the vicinity of Water Oaks Pond. Well, it'll take the better part of the afternoon for those Confederates to halt, stop, and neutralize that Federal counterattack and drive it again back into Jones Field. By now it's 3 o'clock, and the Federals, having suffered heavy attrition, growing concerned about whether they can hold that flank, will decide to retire across Tillman Branch. So now you can begin to see that the right flank of the Hornets Nest is becoming somewhat exposed to Confederate forces now, which are north of the position. Then, after Johnston falls, Confederates will reignite the effort on the extreme Confederate right. And we know that Stuart retires. We know that Union left flank now is beginning to fracture. Hurlbut attempts to hold the line, and up until 4 o'clock, he's quite successful in holding the line in a successive series of positions back across Bloody Pond and on into Wicker Field, stretching over towards the river. But by 4, he realizes he's unable to hold that front, so he retires. And he tells Prentiss and Will Wallace that he has to do so. So they will now have to roll their flank back to pick up what Hurlbut is retiring from. Unbeknownst to them, Sherman and McClernand have decided to move again. And in this move, they completely step back and away from Will Wallace's right flank, and a gap develops. And before the Federals know it, Confederates have worked their way through that gap. All of a sudden, Wallace and Prentiss find themselves cut off at around 5 o'clock, and they now have to try to fight their way out of here. But what they're fighting against now is the entire Confederate Army still active on the field. For at one time, the Confederate left and right flank were over 3 miles apart. They will meet in the rear of the Hornets Nest here at the junction of the Hamburg, Savannah, and Corinth Road, no more than a half mile to our north and east, they will slam the door shut and trap roughly 2,250 federal defenders and capture them in mass. About 5:30, this fight is over. During the course of the late afternoon, Confederates used artillery on this position to try to silence the federal guns and drive them away. It's a large concentration of artillery. As many as 11 to 12 batteries participate. It receives a lot of writing in the reports. It's known as Ruggles Line or Ruggles concentration of artillery. It serves good effect to pin down the Union infantry. It does force the Federal artillery to leave the field. One of the reasons the Federal artillery is leaving the field is they've used up their available ammunition and have to retire to find more. But it isolates the position, pins the Union troops down, and allows the two wings of the Confederate force to envelop or encircle the position. And that's the demise of the Hornets Nest. That's what crushes it from existence, whereas throughout the entire day, the Federal troops here have been masters of all they survey. They've only been hit by piecemeal fragments of the Confederate Army. They've been able to check those easily. But when they're left here, isolated by the retraction of the Union right and the retirement of the Union left, and non-able to successfully get themselves out of the envelopment, a fair number of them will find themselves surrendered, including General Prentice, and Will Wallace will be mortally wounded trying to lead his command to the north and left on the field as dead.
You can watch this or other American History TV programs on the Civil War at any time by visiting our website, cspan.org/history, and watch programs on the Civil War every Saturday evening at 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. Eastern, and Sunday morning at 11 a.m. on C-SPAN 3.